So my next guest, I want to go ahead and thank first and foremost our good friends at the Miami Book Fair International. We've been working with them for feels like almost nearly a decade, but they've been so wonderful to us. Again, they're going to be holding their annual event this year, yet it will be virtual. It will be online. The website is miamibookfaironline.com, and the event will be held virtually November 15th through the 22nd. So my next guest is the Commonwealth Professor of American Studies and History at the University of Virginia. Her previous books include A Nation of Outsiders, How the White Middle Class Fell in Love with Rebellion in Post-War America, and Making Whiteness, the Culture Segregation in the South from 1890 to 1940. Now here's a different twist. The new book she has just put out, entitled this year, is called Cool Town: How Athens, Georgia launched alternative music and changed American culture. And she will be featuring her book at the 38th Annual Miami Book Fair International. Grace Elizabeth Hale joins me. Thanks for being with us, Grace.
Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. What a fascinating chance to go and read about this. And the thing is, compared to some of the previous titles we just mentioned, there is a different story about this book because of the fact that you lived it. You were part of this, so it's really almost you can feel like it's a bit of autobiographical because of all the personal things you could tell. Now, I did not get a chance to read the book. I did get to look at part of what was out there to go and take a look at, and what a lot of people have said about it. So, to put context to why you would be such a good person to write about Athens, Georgia, and the music scene that was there at the time, from the late 70s, early 80s, and continues on today, I must add. You were there in the 80s. You knew the players. You moved there in 1982 to attend University of Georgia, go Bulldogs. You enrolled as a business student, and then 5 years in Athens, you then co-founded the Downstairs Cafe, coffee shop and music club with David Levitt, and you would then join him, and together you had a band called Cordy Lawn that you had together. So you were part of this. You had the certain acts that were brought on to this part. You were in the middle of, just like if you think of, what's the street in Nashville? Beale Street, I think it is. Or just think of, just the idea you were in the center of it all. So talk to me about just, where you were able to go and pull the information from, what happened as part of what you were part as the nucleus of what was Athens, Georgia.
Yeah, that is a lot of the reason that I wrote this book. But to be honest with you, initially it was a barrier because I kept hoping somebody else would write this book. I thought, as somebody who had been a participant, I will say not a starring role. I'm more of one of the members of the chorus, you might say, or the actors whose names would be farther down the screen.
Right.
But as a participant, as part of the sort of circle of what was happening, I kept hoping that some other serious music critic or music historian would write this book, but it didn't happen. And after a friend and really an absolutely brilliantly talented singer-songwriter, Vic Chestnut, who was from Athens, died in 2009, it made me realize that somebody needed to get started interviewing these people, that they wouldn't always be around. And so the book is a little bit memoir. It's mostly history and music criticism. It's not an academic book. It's written for people who love indie alternative music, but there is a little bit of memoir in the story. That really helped me in some ways, though, because when I got started, I at least knew some people to begin to contact. They, of course, would put me in touch with other people. I did almost 100 interviews for this book.
Wow.
But having that sort of experience in the town gave me a starting point. I did learn a lot of things that I didn't know about. So it is not just the story of what I knew or participated in.
Oh, absolutely. No, I know you definitely went much farther out of that spectrum. But the one thing is that with this, I would imagine like the, run-of-the-mill Rolling Stone, NME, Spin Magazine, columnists, they're not looking to go and make the trip to Athens, Georgia. And I guess for yourself, I'd also imagine that if you were interviewed for a said book, if somebody would have taken the initiative like you're saying and done it, you probably would have, I wouldn't have doubted it would have triggered you to go ahead and say, you know what, I know all that's going on here. I can do this book too. I might have to just put up my own copy and put my own recollection and what I can gather of it as an author. I can imagine that also could come in play too.
Yeah, it's a really humbling process, frankly, to try to think back on your life. All of us are really bad at remembering our life stories, and we
Yeah.
often screw these things up when we recollect them. What we remember are the stories, the moments, the feelings. We're bad at timelines and actual
Yeah.
dates, and maybe it was not that club, but another club where I saw that band. So I have to say that interviewing so many people, I had a real sense of humility, even in approaching my own memories, to make sure that I checked them as much as I could against other sources, because all of us do that.
It was just an interesting time. I'm in Florida, so it is something to be said about how Georgia was always depicted, and to see the kind of rock scene would come from this, or not just so much rock. I mean, it was the influences of so much other music that was just guitar, drum, bass driven. The idea of just where I just listened to something on YouTube. There was a station that actually was just putting out the kind of music that chronicled the first 5 years of Athens, from '78 to '83. Everything from, it had some that had ska influence, or it had a folk influence, or a very alternative rock, almost a bit of a new wave influence. So it was definitely something that was just it was a bit of experimental, definitely very in direction where you're just feeling just a flavor that's just so different and so raw and so creative. And it wasn't something that you would find in New York City or London or in Los Angeles. It was just a different sound. I want to profile what Georgia Public Radio said about the book. So they said like this: Athens, Georgia was a sleepy southern college town in the late 1970s and early 80s. Georgia Bulldogs football and established fraternity and sorority scene dominated social life on the campus, but something was percolating on the shadows of Millage Avenue, a creative underground as vibrant and as subversive as any you might find in the country's major cities. It was in this period that Athens became the site of one of the most influential regional music scenes of the late 20th century, spawning groundbreaking bands like the B-52s, Widespread Panic, Pylon, R.E.M., most notably, and others, much like what San Francisco was in the late 60s, Grace, and Seattle was in the early 90s. In the intro of the book, you wrote, quote, "In Athens, Georgia in the 1980s, if you were young and willing to live without much money, anything seemed possible. Magic sparkled like sweat on the skin of dancers at a party or club. Promise winked underfoot like the bits of broken glass embedded in the downtown sidewalks. A new world seemed to be emerging out of our creativity, our music, our art, and our politics, but also the way we understood ourselves and related to each other." Love the way you depicted that. So the inspirations and influences. Talk to me about what did foster this new organic scene. And you did come into this a few years into the middle of this. What were you seeing? What was it that really created all this? That really just, you were catching it right as it's starting to make its really make an evolution.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a few key structural issues. It's an isolated place. It's a very inexpensive place at the time, and there is a large public university there. Now that university, my own alma mater, has pretensions of elite grandeur, but let me just say it didn't then. It was easy to get into, it was cheap to go to, and I see those as strengths, not as weaknesses. So it had a wide variety of students from all over the state mostly, but neighboring states as well. And most importantly, all the resources of that public university, which were available then to the public. You didn't even have to be a student. You could use the library, you could look at the old magazines, you could listen to the old musical recordings and watch important old films in the film library. All of those resources we now take for granted on the web, they were there in the library. So those key factors were there. But at the same time, you had those factors in other places, other college towns, small town college towns across the country. So it's important, I think, to think about a few key individuals. And there, I think it's really important to note the influence of the gay and queer community in Athens. I had grown up around, particularly around the art school, but not entirely. Pretty closeted community, not entirely in the sort of post-World War II era, but that community nurtured a few key individuals like Jeremy Ayers, and much more famous individuals like Ricky Wilson and Keith Strickland, who are key members of the B-52s. And those early key figures really played a role, particularly Jeremy Ayers, who moved off to New York City, became a part of the drag queen burlesque kind of scene there in the late 60s and 70s, got in with Andy Warhol's Factory during the period when Warhol was interested in the drag queens, became a minor Warhol drag queen named Silva Thin, and brought that kind of spirit of creative communal activity back to Athens.
Not too long ago, I read the book FM, which was penned by Richard Neer, about really just the change of what you were hearing with music going on in terms of just the rock guitar based sound that was just changing and evolving so much. So, there might have been a point, obviously, if people were identifying with the South, you're definitely thinking of Southern rock, you're thinking of Allman Brothers, you're thinking of Lynyrd Skynyrd and things like that. We're just we're definitely into the forefront. But the thing was that, obviously there was just late 70s, you're thinking disco, you're thinking where there was a definite move for the next decade to change and real shake-up change. That's why punk was so strong in that. That's why you even heard where ska or breakbeat or just where you just, I guess again, that's why they wanted to call it alternative sound. It just started to make a change. It was interesting how it happened over here. Now, Wikipedia, which take with a grain of salt, the entry they put out for the section called The Music of Athens, Georgia. They say, quote, the contributions of Athens to rock, country music, and bluegrass have earned it the nickname the Liverpool of the South, and the city is known as one of the American birthplaces for both modern alternative rock and new wave music. When you look at Athens, Grace, and its contribution to the annals of music history, why do you think it was able to make such a big impact while being detached to any big city record labels?
Well, I think in part that was why it made a big impact. It was the right time for an isolated place. The revolt against the big music industry, the corporate music industry, really carried across what we sometimes talk about as a kind of revolt against disco or the pushback against stadium rock. I think more than particular genres, there was a kind of revolt against the idea that corporations were creating or managing or controlling what music we get to hear. And sometimes I think people forget that the 70s, late 70s and 80s was a very anti-corporate time for a lot of youth cultures, especially rebelling, during the Reagan era against the kind of rise of the yuppie and the idea that greed is good. There's a real underground movement against that. And so there's a rebellion against the music industry. So not being a center of the music industry actually, paradoxically, in this particular moment is a plus. Whether it's earned or not, it suggests that the music coming out of a place is more authentic, more real. I mean, we can deconstruct that, but that's the kind of reigning idea at the time. New York folks, music critics in New York are hugely important in making Athens this music center, because they really embrace this idea that Athens is full of all of these, in some ways it's a kind of a stereotypical dumb idea, but these southern bumpkins that are just like inherently naturally creative and weird and exotic because they're like some kind of strange gourd growing out of the ground down there, the red clay of Georgia. So there is almost that kind of idea, that kind of stereotypical idea with the music critics, but they're just interested in anything coming out of this place because it seems so exotic, so completely unexpected, unheralded, unimaginable, and that really plays to that helps Athens musicians to get some to get noticed, they all managed to go to New York City and play pretty early in their careers because of this kind of interest.
I'm a big radiophile, so my radio history is where I really look at when it comes to music. It's just, of course, it just comes together, and I just think about the early '80s, and I just think about the fact that the music got very, very soft to contemporary. The corporate rock had kind of really just blown people out a little bit. Too much stakes, too much journey going on, and they just became the establishment. The establishment was just consultants and just really controlling the playlist. That free form of rock that you would hear, if it would have stayed around for the 80s, then you would have heard some of these bands from Athens come to the limelight much sooner across the country. But it is what it is. Now, AV Club, I want to take from a few different stories that had featured the book. So avclub.com reviewed the book, and they said, quote, "Do you make the case that without the small southern college town, there would be no grungy Seattle, no hipster Williamsburg, no weird Austin. While punk, metal, and new wave music was finding audiences bucking against the disco and stadium rock coming from the mainstream." Talking about the niche that the bands in Athens were able to look to carve, and were they any way parallel to what was going on around the country? Because again, at this time, you were saying it again, it's a resistance to this corporate establishment of what was being put out in mainstream music. We wanted something different. We went to the underground, and in the lab, something was being built and created that would become the music of the next decade.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It absolutely has connections to the kind of punk and post-punk revolt going on in New York, and also to a certain degree in LA and Southern California and a few other big cities in America. I think the revolt against disco gets overplayed. I don't know how you feel about that down in Miami. I know you guys like to dance. I think that, there's some interesting like radio disc jockey, stunts about hating disco and all that. But certainly there is a revolt against kind of overproduced, or what is imagined as overproduced, over mechanical, too corporate, too big business music, whatever the sound. I will say in Athens, people love to dance. The gay kind of queer influence on the scene meant that you had to have a dance beat. So there wasn't really that anti-disco thing as much, but absolutely that anti-stadium rock. And really it's shaped against Southern, as you mentioned, against Southern rock, which is, what you're going to be hearing on a lot of radio stations across the Southeast at that time. Macon is not that far from Athens. It's the center of Southern rock. So there was a revolt against that. You do not hear any wanking guitars in Athens music until a decade or plus into it, before anyone will venture to do what I call at least a kind of wanking guitar solo. That is just not acceptable, right? So there is this vision of all of these, in all these places, of creating a kind of authentic, raw, amateur music, and this idea that amateurs can be real, that they can be raw, that this can give us back a kind of authentic feeling and sound in our music. Sometimes, frankly, that just means the music sounds rough and ragged, and the musicians maybe could practice a little, or the recording could be done better. So when you listen to it now, sometimes you can kind of push back against that sort of understanding that amateur always means better. But in this time period, there is that kind of sense that this is where authenticity lies. I mean, what makes Athens so important, and why I think the AV Club pulled out that, made that, argument about what, that this is the ground zero, is Athens is the place that proves that you can do it anywhere. I mean, if punk says you only have to know 3 chords to create your own band, maybe not even that. Athens says you can know those 3 chords, and you can just sit down wherever you are with your friends and your housemates and make that music. You do not have to go to New York City. You do not have to go to LA. In fact, you will be more authentic, more real if you stay where you are, if you mine your local resources. Now we live in this time where everybody loves local food and local art, but that was not a thing in the 70s and 80s.
No.
There wasn't even a concept of that. Local meant bad. That wasn't a concept. And so Athens is a really key site in what we might call this kind of revolution of thinking of local particularity or regional particularity as something that actually is valuable, that you need to actually mine that, dig into that. That is the source of authentic artistic production, whether it's music or some other medium.
Just to unpack from before, anything that corporate touches is just, for me, I'm just a bit of like the nonconformist, where I just feel like the disco had its time, and I think there was a lot in that scene that actually really offered a lot when it came to minorities or LGBTQ. That there was just a lot that was there that could be said about the freedom and the things that were brought from that. So I always respect the scene, but again, it's the same way I would respect the scene like Athens. Again, but anything that has a corporate approach, and when that in the late 70s, 78, 79. When it just died, it needed to. It needed to do something, because I think corporate wanted to just go ahead and cram in so much, because they felt like this has a short shelf life. We're just going to flood the market, and they did, and they destroyed it. It's
Yeah.
their fault. They get out of touch. People from big cities is what happens. But when it
Yeah.
comes to Athens, it was like when I went to college. It's college radio. It's like it's college campus rock, but you're getting great turnout at bars, clubs, concerts for the music's going on. It's just a good new fresh sound, and
Yeah.
it was something to be necessary. So I can love where that started coming from, and it was different. It was just, it was you couldn't expect it to be done in a big corporate like an RCA Records or Capitol or something like that. You just can't get that kind of thing here. So the A&R people, they should learn. They need to just learn. Hey, you know what? There's something good going on in Athens. That's probably what it was word of mouth that made people learn about Athens. But for
Yeah.
me, that I always respect those indie artists and the record labels that are on right now that just can't. There's still good music right now in the underground. Rock is in the mainstream dead, and it saddens me today. It's been like that for a long time, and I'll ask about that in a little bit. But moving along, I want to go now talk about University of Georgia. When they talked to you about this, they're a school newspaper, the Red and Black. You spoke with them about the book, and you told them, quote, "What happened in Athens, quote, began to develop as hipster places in other parts of the South, places like Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and Columbia, South Carolina, also college towns, I might add. Different kinds of music clubs and restaurants, and the general cultural landscape of the music scene didn't exist before Athens. Athens inspired these places, and a really important part of the story is R.E.M. R.E.M. was actually the first band to play in all these places. I thought it was funny, the first time they got together as a band, they played at a birthday party. It was the first time they performed in 1980. And they would play anywhere and everywhere. And everywhere they went, people wanted to find out about this place called Athens and where R.E.M. came from. And, R.E.M. was just starting to make making its name. The mainstream was not going to see them for a while. B-52's might have gotten an album that was, or a song like a Rock Lobster in 1982 that became a mild hit and still is it's like a cult hit today. But again, just some of the rumblings of Athens being looked at as a place to go listen for new music, where new music and new artists were coming in. And that's what you made a point across. Now, one other thing I want to make mention of, well, actually, first part, talk to me about how you mentioned how this did spread into other areas in the South.
Yeah. Well, something that you picked up on earlier and I really didn't address, and that's part of the answer to this. I would say, two things that are going on with the spread here. One are the touring bands, and two is college radio. And you alluded to this earlier, but the college radio is where the DJs can play anything.
Yep.
Even college radio over time, by the late 80s and early 90s, becomes a little bit more routinized, a little bit more organized, or you might use that dreaded word professionalized,
Right.
less creative. But especially in the late 70s through the mid 80s in Athens and other major college radio stations, DJs have a lot of freedom to play what they want, and in Athens they pretty quickly develop local music shows. DJs pull in local music even into their other playlists, and because UOG is considered to be even before Athens music, for some reason it's a pretty well organized, well run music station. Other college radio stations look at their playlists, and so that helps spread Athens music, because they copy from each other, they share their playlists with each other, what's in heavy rotation. But the other thing is, besides college radio, is touring bands. It's live bands touring. Yeah, they might have a little single along with them, or later on a kind of rickety cassette, but that they're selling at the show, or in local music shops, which of course still exist at that time, all the local music shops, and you can buy singles from bands all over the country you've never heard of for $1 or $2. But mostly it's the live show, it's the touring, and R.E.M. is absolutely crucial here, because they're not the first Athens band by a long stretch.
Right.
There are many others before them, but the other bands. We'll just talk about B-52s and Pylon. Some people laugh and say they're commuting to New York. They'll play Athens, and then they might play Atlanta. Maybe they'll play DC, but the main place they play besides Athens is New York City. In the early days, in the late 70s, R.E.M. comes along. These guys will play anywhere, and they do. It's part of the R.E.M myth, but I researched it. It is actually true. They will play hot dog stands. They will play
Wow.
pizza parlors. They will play, this is a thing in this period. So R.E.M's not the only band to do this, but in a lot of parts of the country, the only place that would book a band like this are the gay clubs that'll have a new wave night.
Mm-hmm.
And then they'll book some live music. And so R.E.M will play these clubs. Now, to be fair to the other bands, all the other Athens bands have folks that are queer, gay, gender nonconforming. You don't want to be driving around rural Georgia and Alabama. I mean, there is rampant homophobia at this time. So to be fair, there are real important reasons why some of these bands did not want to tour just in any place out there. People were fearful. Michael Stipe is now very much out as gay, but then was not. And, certainly his public presentation of himself, there are stories of him, and he was actually, he did get mugged once in Athens. People called him a fag and beat him up. So I don't want to diminish that. I think people forget that the favorite insult that replaced the N-word in a lot of parts of the country, at least for a certain segment of young, white, tough kind of kids, was faggot, right? That was the replacement. So there were real reasons people didn't want to tour. But the R.E.M guys, they went everywhere. They slept in their van. If you invited them to your house, they would eat all your food without asking you. And they had no money, right? But they just had this romance of the guys in the beat up van on the road. Pete Buck had read a lot of Kerouac, and they just got out there and they went everywhere, and they really spread the word of Athens and the idea that you could do this wherever you are. You can make your own scene. And bizarrely enough, in a lot of these small towns and college towns around the Southeast and Midwest, some of these first, what we might later call alternative bands, start out as R.E.M cover bands.
Yeah, and you know what? Interesting. Brings up my next point. People would then try to copy them. People wanted to start their own bands, create their own communities like Athens. R.E.M was not only spreading their music, but they were spreading the word about what they would call later alternative culture. And it was a term that didn't even exist when they started doing it. Alternative came to identify new rock from the late 80s to the mid 2000s. And now alternative no longer has that definition. They still use that term, but it means nothing. And my thing is now is that, I've talked to a number of radio people and a lot of people in music about what happened to that music, because it's now all digital. It's just unfortunate. You're not going to hear the things that have like a recording session of a Muscle Shoals, Alabama, or something where you just have this raw instrumental sound. It's not there. My thing is, what do you think is what happened to music and where that music is being played is instrumental? I feel like it's only in Nashville now.
Yeah. I think it's a real shame. I mean, some of it is the proliferation of inexpensive technology. And so people can produce a very produced sound in their own, literally garage or home, whereas, in the old days, a garage band was a garage band because it sounded, if you recorded it, it sounded like crappy recording, because it was. I mean, Pylon's first demo tapes were made on a cassette player on Kmart brand tapes, and they sound like it. You know, so the technology allows us really cheaply to make very produced, very slick recordings anywhere. So I think that is part of it. I guess the question for me arises: why don't more people want to do something different? And I would bet they're out there. I'm just of the generation that I don't know where they are because I'm too old to know. But I think that there are young folks out there making raw sounding, less produced sounding music. Again, the internet is a blessing. The technology is a blessing and a curse. The internet means that you can circulate your music very easily. The question is, who's your audience, right? Who's going to find it?
I think where your audience,
hear it?
I'll tell you where your audience is now. It's TikTok. I mean, for me, it's amazing what kind of influence TikTok has now. And when I've heard some of the rare recordings that have come up that have been brought back to life, and all of a sudden, Fleetwood Mac and Dreams is now a hit again. It's number 20 on the Billboard Hot 100. What, and number one song on the Billboard 200. What happened here?
Yeah.
there is room for this kind of music again. I mean, Fleetwood Mac's a different. That's a super group, one thing. But
Right.
again, rock guitar bass sound. Like, okay, there is an audience for that. The younger audience can come back and embrace that music again. They don't have to hear some kind of a trap bass sound out of a 808 or some other computer bass sound. They will want to hear instrumental. I think
Yeah.
that kind of music can come back, but I mean, it's being held back by the mainstream. It has to be a grassroots movement once again, like Athens, to bring that back again. So you talked to University of Virginia, where we're at now. You're the Arts magazine there, and I want to take us into a positive note as we wrap up the interview. They wrote possibility. It's an idea that keeps coming up on the pages of Hale's book. You told them, quote, Athens also gave me a way to think about the history of possibility. It's not hard to understand why people fail when they try to make a better world. I wanted to ask a different question. What makes people try? The way music has gotten so digital and so homogenized in many respects, do you feel like there is a time now for more possibility, Grace?
I really do. But, I think that we're in a really tough moment. I mean, when are we going to be able to congregate together in crowded,
Yeah.
dirty clubs that don't smell good, where the air conditioning isn't working and we're breaking the fire code? I mean, there's
Yeah.
something about that impulse among young people to crowd together, and so much creativity comes out of that. And I think you see that on TikTok, lots of, at least early on, now, of course, it too is being professionalized, but a lot of amateur, creativity really, really on display on places in social media like TikTok. But I really feel like we need that in-person audience to come back, because that is where you actually meet other producers, other creators, in ways that are unexpected. I mean, yes, you can meet them through the internet, but it's not by chance. You can't catch something that you weren't looking for. It's harder to have the unexpected encounter, or the encounter with something that you might have thought you hated, but now you hear something in it. Maybe it's, again, just because I'm older, but I feel like part of the revolution is going to be the underground coming back, in a face-to-face way. And we were seeing this before the pandemic in the kind of house culture, house party culture that is really, really vibrant in cities like Richmond, Virginia, and other places, often, again, linked to college campuses. Young people who don't have money, or with clubs, there's not a professional club infrastructure, but there wasn't in Athens either in the beginning. House parties were key. And that was really, really thriving in a lot of locations
Yeah.
before the pandemic. And hopefully that will come back.
I think what's going to happen and with this pandemic, a lot of entertainment has been shuttered. And I'm looking about, I got another interview coming up that I'm going to be recording when it comes to what's going on in New York in terms of Broadway being shut down, foreseeable future, at least until summer of 2021, or even more after that. Same thing with movies, just the entertainment that we have. I think if there is a time where it feels like, politics are really in our face, which is always that way, music was always the one factor that if you wanted to break away and escape what was going on and really vent and really just feel all this raw energy and put it into something, music was that. And you can't do that with machines. You could do that with instruments. You could do that with on stage performance. I think we're going to get the idea of speakeasies again. I think there are going to be, like you said, these house parties. I think there's going to be this underground movement that's going to come from this, and out of the masses, it's going to just go ahead and bring us. There will be an opening of a crossover again, which is what we had in the 80s and 90s of different music that was coming out that we could appreciate. And I think that crossover needs to come back into music again, where it makes it into the charts. It makes it into where people could go ahead and find it once again. And there's a rumbling. There's an interest. Okay, this underground movement grows from it, and then it starts up, and then people start attaching themselves again. I feel like this can come from it. I guess the only thing I think is that, are there any groups? I mean, would like an R.E.M. Would there be groups like that when they're looking at the Athens music scene now, before the pandemic, it was still somewhat thriving. There was a lot of music going on now. Is there any kind of mentorship going on, or anything that can be done in order to just, get some kind of either music capital or something to just help, foster and mentor some of these groups so they can make it to somewhere again? If they can make it into a record label and get a deal and get the chance to be noticed, and then start a new movement of this music.
Yeah, you see that happening in Athens today. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bands.
Yeah.
There's an old friend of mine who still lives there and runs a recording studio and the music business program at UGA too now, and his name's David Garvey. And he says there's over 500 bands there
Wow.
at any given moment, and they are absolutely mentored by older musicians who've been around forever. One big problem in Athens, though, is there have been various local labels that have been established, but none of them have ever really kind of hit that little bit of a level where you're local, but you've got sort of a little bit of a widespread, nationally sort of known, but locally based. It doesn't seem like the music labels that have been started in Athens over the years have ever hit that kind of sweet spot. Athens bands used to, in fact, be much more frequently on Atlanta labels like DB Records. But so there is a need for that. There's a need for that kind of recording, a record label. But that works in a totally different way now, right? I mean, the way record labels work. But just before we run out of time, I want to put a shout out for Pylon, a group that is releasing all of their catalog is being re-released on New West Records, both individually and in a really fancy, beautiful box set with a book. And I think TikTok really needs Pylon. So all you TikTok video makers out there, I think, put Fleetwood Mac aside and start using Pylon.
No, I agree. But I'll say this too, and this is just for me. In other countries like the UK or Canada, they have actually government programs, or they have things where where the public interest will help to try to get this kind of music together. NPR, I want to outcry to them. Put a music show on or a music podcast on that offers room. You did Austin City Limits for many years. Why can't you do something for Athens? Why can't we do that for music again? That's what I work. That's where I want to come from with things.
I think it's a great idea. I mean, take the idea of the Tiny Desk concert and let's go bigger with that. Let's have much more of that kind of musical programming coming from NPR, from public, state level public radio stations and television stations. All of those things could program more of this kind of music, and hopefully they will in the future.
Exactly. There we go. We'll leave it there. Now, real quickly, you're going to be at the 38th annual Miami Book Fair International, which is going to be held virtually November 15th to the 22nd. Website is miamibookfaironline.com. Tell our listeners when we can see you.
I don't actually know.
So it's going to be, the schedule's coming up and you'll find out pretty soon.
Yes, I apologize. The materials
it's okay.
Pre-recorded, and there's going to be some live Q&As, but they have not let me know the schedule. So
no problem. And I also see your website. You have it is your full name, GraceElizabethHale.com. And also, where can people go and follow you on social media?
I am on Twitter only. I'm not much of a social media person, I have to say. Facebook is evil. But
I agree.
Hale on Twitter if you want to follow me.
All right, fantastic. Again, I've been joined by Grace Elizabeth Hale. Again, she is Commonwealth Professor of American Studies and History at the University of Virginia and author of Cool Town, How Athens, Georgia Launched Alternative Music and Changed American Culture. Go find the book. Grab yourself a copy today. Grace, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.